The sun was barely up on the morning of October 12, 1944. The Pacific Ocean, which had been a silent witness to countless naval engagements, now churned with intensity. The waves, still dark from the night's endless battle with the winds, crashed violently against the sides of ships. The air, thick with the scent of salt and the metallic tang of engine fuel, trembled with the sound of distant explosions. Above the fleet, the sky was a dull, unyielding gray, reflecting the oppressive atmosphere that loomed over the sea. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The Japanese convoy, some 20 miles from the Philippines, steamed onward, its ships cutting through the Pacific as part of the last desperate attempts to resupply their forces on Lady Island. These vessels, vital lifelines to the Japanese Imperial Army, were unaware of the impending doom that was slowly descending upon them. Behind their armor, sailors went about their work with a sense of routine, but the calm before the storm was about to break. In the skies above, American pilots from the 7th Fleet's Task Force 38 prepared for an assault unlike any the world had ever seen. On the decks of the ships, life seemed almost normal for the men aboard. Yet there was a sharp sense of unease. The Japanese had grown increasingly aware of the dangers lurking in the waters of the Pacific, and rumors of American air superiority had filtered down to every sailor. The fleet had been attacked before, and its scars were still fresh in the minds of many. Still, no one could predict the chaos that was about to erupt. A brief flash of light, then a roar. It was the sound of history being made. The planes of the United States Navy, flying at breakneck speeds, had launched their attack. But this time their weapons were unlike anything the Japanese had encountered before. Napalm shells, the terrifying firebombs designed to create hellish infernos, were now streaking down from the skies, targeting the convoy with brutal precision. The first strike landed with an explosion that echoed across the waters, a burst of flame that spread like a wildfire over the sea. The Japanese sailors, used to the risks of war, froze in disbelief as the fires erupted on their ships. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. The sailors, caught off guard by the violence and the horror of the flames, could do little to stop the spread. The ship's decks became an inferno as the shells ripped through the hulls and panic spread like wildfire among the ranks. The brutality of the attack, sudden and unrelenting, took everyone by surprise. For those aboard the Japanese convoy, the reality of war had just shifted into something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. As the fire raged on, their world of routine and certainty crumbled before their eyes. This was not just an airstrike. It was the arrival of an unrelenting force of nature. The napalm shells, with their overwhelming destructive power, had transformed the battlefield into a furnace. As the pilots of the American forces zoomed back toward their base, they left behind a scene that would forever be etched into the minds of the men on the ground below. For the Japanese sailors, this was no ordinary attack. It was a reminder that the tides of war had turned. The relentless power of American air superiority had just demonstrated the terrifying potency of a new weapon. And for the first time, the sailors on those convoys knew that the American forces, no longer content with merely striking from the sea or air, had brought the full force of technological advancement to bear, in a way that would forever change the course of the Pacific War. The year was 1944, and the Pacific theater had become a vast, volatile expanse where the fortunes of war shifted with every passing moment. The Japanese Empire, once a formidable force that had rapidly expanded across Asia and the Pacific, was now reeling under the relentless blows dealt by the Allied powers. The Empire's resource-rich territories were slowly being reclaimed by American forces, and its once feared navy was slowly being whittled down by a superior Allied strategy that had gained momentum throughout the course of the war. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval engagements in history, was unfolding just as the Pacific War entered its final decisive phase. For months, Allied forces had been preparing for the invasion of the Philippines, and the strategic significance of this operation could not have been overstated. Control of the islands would not only pave the way for future operations in Southeast Asia, but would also cut off Japanese supply lines to their forces throughout the Pacific. The battle for Leyte Island itself was about to begin, but the Japanese were determined to prevent the Allied forces from achieving this crucial victory. In their desperation, they committed their remaining naval forces to block the invasion. knowing full well that failure meant the end of their dreams of Pacific dominance. On the Japanese side, the preparations were meticulous. The Imperial Navy, while heavily battered by prior engagements such as the Battle of Midway and the Solomon Islands campaign, still retained formidable units. But they were now fighting with dwindling resources, and their once vibrant war machine was starting to show the strain. The convoy that was attacked by American planes on October 12th was part of this final attempt to resupply forces on Leyte, a high-risk maneuver designed to ensure the continuation of the fight. The American strategy, led by Admiral William Halsey and General Douglas MacArthur, was one of overwhelming force. With the superiority of Allied intelligence, which tracked the movements of the Japanese Navy, the Americans knew that the Japanese were attempting to block the invasion and had set their sights on decimating the remaining supply convoys. The coordination between air and sea forces had reached a level of precision that would soon prove devastating for the Japanese. At the core of this strategy was the use of new technology that pushed the boundaries of warfare. American bombers flying high above the ocean carried bombs unlike anything seen before. Napalm had been used before in smaller-scale operations, but its implementation in large-scale naval engagements was a game-changer. The success of this new weapon stemmed from its ability to inflict massive casualties and destruction, but also its psychological impact. The Japanese, already fighting a war on multiple fronts, had not anticipated the sheer brutality and precision with which these weapons could be deployed. This technology, combined with the overwhelming air superiority held by the United States, turned the Pacific into a landscape of terror for the Japanese sailors. As the planes climbed into the air, the weight of history hung in the balance. The war that had started with such rapid aggression from the Japanese now found them at the mercy of a force far greater than they could have anticipated. The once vaunted Imperial Navy was being pounded into submission, and the naval superiority they had once enjoyed was quickly fading. On the ground, in the bustling command centers of the American fleet, there was a growing sense of determination. General MacArthur, who had famously vowed to return to the Philippines, had already made significant progress in the Pacific, but the Battle of Leyte would be his crowning achievement. In the back rooms of military headquarters, the flicker of maps illuminated the faces of strategists who had spent years piecing together the puzzle of how to defeat the Japanese in their own backyard. They knew that the loss of Leyte would be a major blow to the Japanese Empire, but more importantly, it would bring the end of the war closer. The Japanese, on the other hand, had been slowly realizing that the odds were stacking against them. The walls of their empire were crumbling, and the resupply missions to Leyte were becoming increasingly desperate. The strategy they relied on, hoping to disrupt the American invasion by any means necessary, was flawed from the start. Their forces were stretched thin, and the Americans had the upper hand in terms of both technology and tactics. As the Japanese convoys sailed into the vast expanse of the Pacific, they did so with a sense of foreboding. The sea, which had once been their domain, was now the very thing that threatened to swallow them. Unbeknownst to them, the storm that was about to descend upon them would not just alter the course of the Battle of Leyte, it would also serve as a stark reminder of the relentless nature of the war. With their backs to the wall, the Japanese were forced to fight for survival. But the tide of the war had already begun to shift. The precision of American air power, combined with the destructive might of napalm, made clear that the old order of warfare, one that relied on the dominance of large, powerful naval fleets, was rapidly becoming obsolete. As the sun burned fiercely overhead, the heat from the napalm strikes intensified, turning the ocean into a blazing cauldron of fire and chaos. The screams of the wounded and dying were drowned by the deafening roar of the explosions, the crackling of flames eating away at the ships, and the deafening sound of gunfire that followed in a desperate attempt to ward off the assault. It was no longer a battle for control. It was a battle for survival. The Japanese sailors, caught in the heart of the inferno, were fighting not only their enemies but also the elements themselves. The heat was unbearable. The once pristine decks of their ships, now slick with oil and blood, were transformed into a deadly playground for the flames. The convoys, meant to resupply and reinforce their forces on Leyte, were now being reduced to floating pyres. What had once been a symbol of naval power and pride was now a victim of its own vulnerability. At the center of this hellish nightmare was the Japanese destroyer Mochizuki, whose crew had bravely attempted to fight back against the oncoming American bombardment. However, no amount of anti-aircraft fire or evasive maneuvers could protect them from the onslaught that came from above. The planes, equipped with precision-guided napalm shells, swooped in and unloaded their payloads. With each explosion, the ship was engulfed in flames, its hull buckling under the combined force of the firestorm. The sailors aboard the Mochizuki fought valiantly, but the flames consumed everything in their path. The fire not only decimated the ship's structure, but also rendered its weaponry useless. What was once a formidable force on the open sea was now a helpless target, adrift in the ocean of flames. The men aboard, many of whom had joined the Imperial Navy in hopes of glory and honor, now faced an agonizing end, their efforts to save their ship futile against the overwhelming power of the napalm shells. But it wasn't just the ships that suffered. The convoys designed to transport vital supplies to the island of Leyte were now mere floating targets for American bombers. As the flames spread from one vessel to another, the carnage grew. The ocean, once a place of untold beauty and power, now became a witness to the brutal reality of war. Sailors who had once sailed proudly under the flag of the Japanese Empire were now scrambling to survive, clinging to life in the face of an inferno that seemed to have no end. The psychological toll on the Japanese sailors was profound. Many of the men, especially the younger recruits who had never before experienced the full scale of warfare, were utterly terrified. The fear was palpable, the realization that death could come at any moment, and in the most agonizing way, was too much for many to bear. The panic was not confined to the lower decks. It spread throughout the fleet as sailors tried to make sense of what was happening to them. The sight of their comrades burning alive, the smell of scorched flesh and metal, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness were unlike anything they had ever encountered. For some, the fear was so intense that they abandoned their posts, fleeing into the water in a desperate bid for survival. But amidst the terror, there were those who continued to fight back. The Japanese gunners, though outmatched by the superior American aircraft, did not surrender easily. They fired their weapons with desperate determination, hoping to strike back at the planes that had turned their world into an inferno. Yet their efforts were in vain. The American bombers, expertly flown and equipped with napalm bombs, showed no mercy. Each strike was precise, each explosion deadly. The Japanese, though brave, could not match the technological might of the Americans. For the pilots of the United States Navy, it was a moment of grim satisfaction. The success of their strike was not just a testament to their superior tactics, but also to the unrelenting power of their new weapon. Napalm, a substance that could turn any battlefield into a sea of flames, had been deployed with devastating effect. The psychological impact on the Japanese forces was immediate. What had once been a struggle between two naval powers was now a lopsided battle, with the technological edge firmly in the hands of the Americans. As the planes pulled away from the smoking wreckage below, they left behind a scene of devastation that would forever be etched into the memories of the survivors. The destruction was total. The once proud Japanese convoy was now a shattered remnant of its former self. The men who had survived the napalm strikes would forever carry the scars of that day, both physical and psychological. The terror they experienced would stay with them long after the flames had burned out. This was the turning point in the Battle of Leyte. The Japanese, though determined, were now in full retreat. The attack had crippled their naval forces and, with it, their ability to sustain a meaningful defense of the Philippines. What had been a high-risk mission to prevent the American invasion was now a catastrophic failure. The psychological damage to the Japanese forces was profound. Not only had they lost valuable ships and men, but they had also suffered a blow to their morale that would resonate through the remainder of the war. The American forces, on the other hand, had not only achieved a tactical victory, but had also sent a clear message to the Japanese. The full weight of the United States' technological and military might had been unleashed. The Japanese Navy, once a force to be reckoned with, was now in retreat, and the United States had cemented its dominance in the Pacific. The Battle of Leyte was not just a military victory. It was a psychological turning point that would shape the future of the Pacific War. The flames of October 12, 1944, were not yet fully extinguished, but their consequences were already being felt across the Pacific. The once proud Japanese Navy, left smoldering in the wake of the American Napalm assault, had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. The loss of the convoy was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological and strategic turning point that reverberated far beyond the battlefield. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the Japanese forces, battered and demoralized, realized that the tides of war had irrevocably shifted. The United States, through its overwhelming technological superiority and precise coordinated strikes, had proven that no corner of the Pacific was beyond its reach. The psychological impact on the Japanese soldiers, already weary from years of war, was profound. The fear that gripped the sailors as they watched their comrades burn alive and their ships sink beneath the waves would linger long after the flames had died down. For the Americans, however, the victory was bittersweet. While the strike on the Japanese convoy was a clear success, it was also a reminder of the brutal nature of modern warfare. The use of napalm, though effective in achieving military objectives, left behind a trail of devastation that was difficult to reconcile. The flames, once seen as a weapon of precision, had also become a symbol of the unrelenting destruction that had come to define World War II. The psychological toll on the American pilots, many of whom had witnessed the carnage they had inflicted, was significant. While they had triumphed, they had also participated in a level of destruction that was hard to ignore. The aftermath of the napalm attack marked a crucial shift in the war. The Japanese, now facing the collapse of their naval power, were forced to retreat. The American invasion of Leyte Island, already underway, was met with little resistance from the battered Japanese forces. The strategic value of Leyte, crucial for the resupply and reinforcement of Japanese forces in the Philippines, was now firmly in American hands. The conquest of Leyte would pave the way for future victories in the Pacific, ultimately leading to the liberation of the Philippines and the eventual defeat of Japan. But the impact of the Battle of Leyte was not just confined to the military realm. The attack had profound implications for the nature of warfare itself. Napalm, with its terrifying effectiveness, would become a symbol of the modern industrialized war. The use of firebombs in World War II, particularly in the Pacific theater, would leave lasting scars on both the soldiers and the civilian populations that found themselves in its path. The images of scorched earth, of entire cities reduced to ash, would haunt the world for decades to come. In the years that followed, the Battle of Leyte and the napalm strikes would become a critical moment in the study of modern warfare. The effectiveness of precision bombing, particularly with incendiary weapons, would be further refined in subsequent conflicts, but so too would the ethical considerations surrounding their use. As the world moved from one war to another, the memory of those flames would serve as a stark reminder of the price of victory. For the Japanese, the Battle of Leyte was not the final nail in their coffin, but it marked the beginning of the end. The defeat was crushing, but it also exposed the cracks in their imperial ambitions. In the months that followed, as American forces closed in on Japan's home islands, the Japanese would continue to fight, but the relentless pressure from the Allies, combined with the loss of key territories and the crippling of their navy, left them with little hope of a successful defense. For the United States, the victory at Leyte represented a critical step toward final victory in the Pacific. The destruction of the Japanese convoy had severely weakened their naval capacity, making it impossible for them to continue their attempts to resupply and reinforce their forces. The road to Japan was now wide open, and the Allied forces would press forward with renewed vigor, knowing that their ultimate goal, an end to the war in the Pacific, was finally within reach. But beyond the military strategy, the Battle of Leyte and the use of napalm had a profound moral and psychological impact on all who participated in the conflict. For those who fought in the skies and on the seas, it was a harsh reminder of the terrible cost of war. The legacy of that day, the burning ships, the screams of the dying, the inferno that consumed the Pacific, would stay with the survivors for the rest of their lives. They had been part of a war machine that had turned the ocean into a graveyard, and though they had won the battle, they had also witnessed the brutal cost of victory. In the decades that followed, the Pacific War, and particularly the use of napalm, would remain a subject of intense debate. The ethics of using incendiary bombs, which caused horrific burns and suffering to both military personnel and civilians, would be questioned by future generations. The horrors of World War II would ultimately serve as a sobering lesson in the limits of warfare and the human cost of technological advancements. The Battle of Leyte, and the events that unfolded on that fateful day in October 1944, was more than just a moment in the history of the Pacific War. It was a harbinger of the changes that would come to define warfare in the modern age. The overwhelming destructive power of napalm and its devastating psychological impact would continue to shape the way the world viewed conflict, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the final shots of the war were fired. This was not just a victory for the American forces. It was a victory for the terrifying capabilities of modern warfare, a victory that carried with it a heavy moral burden, one that would echo through history, reminding us all of the price of technological power in the midst of human conflict.